Let's get started with this question 8. So 25-mark question. Evaluate the possible economic causes of income and wealth inequalities within a country like Brazil. So a bit more of a development type question. Let's have a read of the stem. In terms of income distribution and wealth distribution, Brazil is one of the most unequal countries within the world. Its Gini coefficient value is 0.449 and is ranked number 2 in the world for its wealth inequality. So of course, Gini coefficient measuring the income inequality, and also it's second in the world for wealth inequality. Now let's take a deep dive into this question and try to solve this question. Questions like this tend to overwhelm students quite a lot. There's lots of words, there's lots of different links, but let's try narrow this down and I'll show you my thought process to make this extremely simple. So the question is asking us, evaluate possible economic causes of income and wealth inequality, then gives us an example of a country like Brazil. So questions like this tend to overwhelm students since it's very simple but has lots of different links. So let's break this down in a really step-by-step manner. So the question is essentially asking us economic causes of income and wealth inequalities, and then it gives us an example of a country like Brazil. So let's split that into half and just think about income. What are some causes of income inequality? And that now is a really simple question. Why do people make low incomes? Since if you think about it really simply, they don't have a good job. Why do individuals not have good jobs? Since they're not very skilled, maybe they haven't gone to university, they haven't got the training. And that pretty much is our entire paragraph point. What is one of the biggest percentage of GDP? What is one of the biggest things the government provides, which is usually education. Therefore, essentially the chain of analysis here would be poor education leads to, of course, I'd add more detail when I'm writing it, but poor education will lead to low human capital. Essentially, individuals do not get skilled, therefore they're unproductive, and if they're unproductive, they can only demand, they will only receive low wages as they produce low output. And that is pretty much what I would write for that first paragraph. So the causes of income inequality would be due to poor education. Now let's think about the other side of the spectrum, which is wealth inequality. Now there's lots of different ways individuals obtain wealth, but one way, of course, and a classic and the most common way that individuals become very wealthy is via inheritance. So when individuals' parents pass away, of course, that wealth is distributed down to the children. Therefore, although they probably haven't worked for it, they will now obtain that wealth. But therefore, how do we stop that inequality where Jeff Bezos' children are gaining billions in wealth, whereas an individual Brazilian farmer whose dad might only leave him one pot of soil, he will of course inherit basically nothing, whilst Jeff Bezos' children inherit billions. And of course, I'm sure you've heard of it, but this would be called inheritance tax. So a way we can reduce the wealth inequality would be installing a tax on inheritance, thus meaning it helps redistribute the income. So the wealthy individuals who are inheriting billions, millions, some of that would be taxed away and then would be added to the government's pot of money, which they could of course spend on providing public services to reduce that gap, the income inequality and just the general inequality gap. But another point we can mention on taxes, which would help reduce inequality, is of course the tax systems. As we're assuming, does this country have a progressive tax system? Is it truly progressive? For example, is a top rate of income tax high, quite relatively high compared to the low? Since if the lowest rate of income tax isn't very different from the highest rate of income tax, it means that the tax rate is not truly progressive and low income earners are being taxed very similarly to high income earners. And thinking about indirect taxes, a classic one, of course, that we even call regressive within the UK, VAT. VAT is, of course, an indirect tax where it's a flat rate tax where all individuals pay the same amount. And the reason why it has regressive effects is that it's a low income households, it's a much larger proportion of the income compared to high income households. And this could be a massive thing here. In countries like Brazil, most of the tax revenue income for the government comes from indirect taxes. This means the low income households are being heavily exploited with these regressive taxes such as VAT. So we'll get into the paragraph points here. I know these questions, since of course there's a choice with your 25-mark questions. A lot of individuals avoid these development type questions. Let's get that down into some paragraphs. And of course, I do understand this is usually going to be the more neglected question compared to question 7, since it's more on the development type topic. And for these questions, essentially what you need to score really well, of course, you need a good basis in the spec. So you need to know Unit 4 quite well. But then also, you need to have a lot of real-world application. Countries you know, developing economies you know, just massive fact files. This is why if any individual if any student does A-level geography, these questions should be a gem, since I'm assuming, and I've had a few A-level geography students where they learn lots of real-world country examples. Therefore, for these questions, they can just provide so many stats and figures and just excel at these questions. But even if you're not an A-level geography student, just an A-level economics student, by learning case studies, and if you really want to spend some time on it, learn a few case studies of developed countries, some industries for micro, and you can really excel at these type of questions. Let's get started with our first paragraph point, which of course would be poor access to education. And a great bit of application to back this up is only around 15% of young adults from Brazil progress to higher education, so university, which is of course an extremely low percent. It is in developing countries around 50-60%, which really acts as a great comparison to show the levels of inequality there is. And something that amplifies this problem is that of these 50%, 70% of these individuals will attend private universities, which of course means that it totally limits and it totally excludes the low-income households. It stops that social mobility to climb up that social ladder, thus reduce that level of inequality. And the rest of the 30% of individuals who are able to attend those free universities is extremely competitive, and it's usually reserved for the individuals, the upper/middle class, who have the money to, for example, prep for the exams, to pay for the entrance. But the poor levels of education in the end will lead to what? It means individuals will come out with low-skilled, there will be low-skilled labour, you can talk about productivity, but in the end the main thing is that it will lead to low levels of human capital. And if the capital is low levels of human capital, why are we saying it's low levels of human capital? They have low skills, they are fairly unproductive, and if they have low levels of human capital, like we said, this is due to low skills, they have low productivity levels. Now, if these workers have low productivity, what does that mean? It means low output per unit time, and specifically low output. Now, how is that going to affect their wages? It means that they will be forced to accept, if you're a low-skilled labour, if you think back to labour markets, you'll be forced to accept low wages. As for example, you can contrast the wage of a low-skilled labour, such as a McDonald's worker, to a high-skilled worker, for example, a cardiothoracic surgeon, where the wages are of course very high for the cardiothoracic surgeon, and the wages for McDonald's workers are fairly low. So they're forced to accept low wages. And what you can add to this is also which furthers the level of inequality. And another great bit you can add to this is what sectors are they usually accepting these low wages in, is sectors such as agriculture. And of course there's massive chains of analysis where you can develop onto how agriculture itself, with it being an informal economy, things like that, it does leads to inequality itself. Maybe even linking it to something like the Lewis model. But, and of course the main thing there, if workers are forced to accept low wages, it will therefore mean low incomes for workers, low disposable incomes for workers, meaning that of course this can increase the level of income inequality. Why? Because you have those individuals who were able to attend those private universities, for example, who were able to pay for the higher level of education in Brazil. They will gain a high level of skill, they will be able to work the higher roles in the economy, thus demand higher wages, whereas these low income workers, due to low levels of education, will lead to low incomes. Thus means that the gap between the highest income earners and the lowest income earners will remain large. And a great bit of application to actually put this into some perspective is that the average productivity of a Brazilian worker is 25% that of an American worker. Now that's no sort of discrimination, that is simply due to the fact that they have an access to poorer levels of education, they're not as skilled, thus cannot be as productive. A great link you can add to this chain of analysis is firms, as if the entire workforce is unproductive, like we said, it's going to lead to low levels of output. Now, how is that going to affect firms? Low levels of output, of course, are going to lead to low levels of sales, low revenue, low profits for firms. Then this compounds and it just leads to this vicious cycle where, as these firms are now making low profits, it's going to lead to low corporation tax for the government. If there's low corporation tax for the government, it means the government has less tax revenue to spend, meaning that they can't invest as much into public services, into services like education. Thus, like I said, it maintains this vicious cycle of inequality. And that can be backed up perfectly with a stat like corporation tax in Brazil is only around 3.6% of GDP, when in developing countries it is around 5% of GDP. So now, moving on to valuation, this point is going to be embedded in how much Brazil spends. So Brazil spends about 5.8% of its GDP on education, which is a perfect amount, a good amount for a developing economy to spend on education. So the way I'm going to comment on it is the time lag, essentially, saying that Brazil is spending enough on education. Now, it just depends on the time frame, so between the short and the long run, since there is a time lag between spending on education and, of course, the results to be translated within the economy. For example, if you start spending on nurseries, it's going to be 20 years, nearly 15 years down the line, where those individuals graduate from university, where those effects in the economy are felt. So it depends on the time lag. With regards to the second evaluation point, another great point you can mention is is, of course, like I always suggest students, read through your chain of analysis and see if there's any assumptions, any constraints, any limitations to the chain of analysis. One point here, EWG, only 15% of young adults progress to university. A great bit of application you can include there is saying, have an evaluation, and the point is kind of going to be quality rather than quantity. Yes, we can increase this enrollment rate massively, but it depends whether it's actually going to affect the quality of enrollment. So yeah, we can maybe get 25, 35, 75% into university, but will these individuals receive a high level, a good level of education where it will actually be useful for their skills, for their human capital to go to university? So if we spend all our resources trying to get these individuals into this high level of education, it may lead to the quality of the education suffering itself. Okay, moving on to the second paragraph. This is going to be on taxes. Now you could either structure this saying the lack of a progressive tax system, which is also a great paragraph, but the way I'm going to do it is the high reliance on regressive indirect taxes such as VAT in developing economies. Okay, so this paragraph is essentially going to be explaining why VAT is a regressive tax. With regards to Brazil's VAT level, they have a multi-tiered VAT level, so there's no set figure. Like the UK is 20% on all goods and services. Brazil is a bit different. It averages to around 25 to 30% on all goods and services, which is relatively high. But another major problem with that is bureaucracy, since it's not one level where they're just going to charge 20% on each good. It means that there's lots of time invested, lots of resources invested. Of course, you can talk about misallocation of resources here into trying to calculate the level and the revenue from VAT due to its complexities. So now let's actually go on to explain what VAT is. And so now the rest of the chain of analysis is essentially explaining what VAT is and how it's causing this income inequality. So VAT is of course a flat rate tax, meaning all individuals will pay the same percentage of VAT. So in the UK, of course, it is 20%. But now, why do we call it regressive, and why does this cause inequality? First things first is that low income households have a higher MPC, they have a higher marginal propensity to consume, therefore they consume more. So this flat rate of tax means that low income households will pay a larger proportion of their income in tax rather than contrasting it to a high income household. As, for example, if two individuals, a millionaire and a working class individual, buys a Snickers bar, that Snickers bar is £1, that they both pay 20p of VAT in the UK on that Snickers bar. That 20 pence of VAT may be 1% of that middle class individual's income, whereas that 20p might be 0.00001% of this high income individual's income, therefore meaning it disproportionately will affect this lower class, this middle class individual, meaning that it will increase the levels of inequality. Since that's why we call it, that's why due to VAT being a flat rate of tax, a flat rate on everyone, we call it regressive, as it affects the low income households disproportionately. So it reduces low income households' disposable income. It means that they have lower purchasing power, and at the end of the day, of course, increases in the level of wealth inequality, and of course thus leading to a larger Gini coefficient value. And like I mentioned earlier, Brazil, around 50% of their tax revenue comes from these indirect taxes, which are of course regressive, which therefore do further amplify the levels of income inequality. And for the higher level students, this is a little point you can add here, where you can mention towards the end of the chain of analysis, it shows that Brazil's fiscal policy is fairly ineffective. And just simply by fiscal policy, we mean how they use their taxes. Since the taxes are not redistributing their income. Of course, one macro objective for all governments is to reduce the levels of inequality, and thus it will improve living standards. Whereas this fiscal policy, this tax system is of course not doing this effectively. And a great little niche point we can look at, if we look at Gini coefficient values, we can also look in a bit more detail and look at Gini coefficient values pre-tax and post-tax. So before individuals are taxed and after individuals are taxed. What we're usually meant to see after individuals are taxed, it's usually meant to reduce the Gini coefficient value significantly, as of course that tax is used to redistribute income. As in the UK, what do? They tax the high income earners a high amount. Why? Because they use that tax they give from high income earners to spend on public expenditure, to fund things like the free NHS, schooling, which helps the low income individuals. But to put this into some perspective, Brazil, pre and post tax, so once Brazil taxes its population, the Gini coefficient value only falls 3 points. Whereas a developed economy like France, once they tax their population, the Gini coefficient value falls over 18 points. So it really puts into some perspective the ineffectiveness of this fiscal policy, of this tax system, as it really does not do its main job, which is to do, of course, what? To redistribute the income and reduce the gap, reduce the inequality, and of course improve living standards in the end. You 100% don't need to add that, but for the individuals who are looking for a bit more of a spark in their exam, it can definitely do a bit more research into it. It's a really good point to add. So Gini coefficient values pre-tax and post-tax. And that is a quick brief summary of what I've written. But now let's move on to evaluation. So my first evaluation point is going to be how in evaluation this depends on the structure of the economy. As VAT as a tax is fairly easy to collect and hard to evade, since it's literally on every single good and service. The reason why this works really well in developing countries such as Brazil is that a lot of the economy is employed in the informal sector. Over 40% of individuals are employed in the informal sector, such as agriculture, where they're not paid like through companies, they're just paid basically cash in hand essentially. Thus meaning it would be extremely hard for Brazil to collect tax via things like income tax, corporation tax, since like I said, it's an informal sector, it doesn't pay actual taxes, they pay mostly cash in hand. Thus meaning, due to the structure of around 40% of individuals working in the informal sector, it would mean if the Brazilian government relied on progressive tax systems, there would be mass tax evasion, thus meaning it would massively reduce the levels of tax revenue. So although VAT worsens inequality, it provides a stable tax revenue source which is needed to fund public expenditure and social programs. It's almost like a necessary compromise. And then for a second evaluation point, you talk about how the government allocates these resources. So this tax revenue gains, whether it uses it to try to reduce the level of inequality. So it could be almost balanced out why, yes, VAT is a regressive tax, but they're spending a lot on public expenditure. They're spending a lot on education, schooling, hospitals. It could definitely have a more substantial effect on reducing inequality. And then also what you could evaluate using is another tax which could be more effective, saying how in valuation this depends on whether another tax could be more effective. A great example would be a windfall tax, such as like the UK government, whenever these like the energy firms made a massive profit, and why will that help reduce the levels of inequality? Since the richest in society are getting massively taxed, whereas the rest of society is not affected. So there's something like a windfall tax could really help reduce the levels of inequality within the country. But yeah, that is pretty much a wrap for this question. Development questions are always a bit they're not the most liked by students. So yeah, just try your best. Of course, practice writing it out. It's great for practice, so it means that if a question like this comes up, you will be prepared. But yeah, that is this 2020 paper 2 done, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next paper.